Okay, good afternoon. My name is Alan Skinner. History 513 American Revolution, Week 2 video discussion. In this discussion, I will critically analyze the key points of James Byrd's essay, Teacheth My Hands to War and My Fingers to Fight, which discusses how American revolutionaries employed the image of King David as a biblical patriot. After outlining Byrd's thesis, the essay will analyze the key points using selected scholarly works and end with tentative conclusions and avenues for further research. In April 1759, a Massachusetts Congregationalist preacher, Sylvanus Conant, preached a discourse to militiamen before they entered combat during the French and Indian War. In his sermon, Conant quoted the prayer of David from Psalm 144, verse 1, quote, "Blessed be the Lord my strength, which teaches my hands to war and my fingers to fight," end quote. From that verse, Conant drew 3 points. First, the lawfulness of war in defense of our liberties, properties, and lives, end quote. Secondly, God was the teacher of war. And lastly, the colonists fought under the temporal leadership officers subject to the greatest and best of earthly kings. According to author James Byrd, Psalm 144 was commonly invoked by preachers in colonial America to justify fighting both against native warriors as well as Catholic Frenchmen. Reverend Conant and other American ministers stressed the importance of learning the science and art of combat or the preparing of hands to war. However, Goliath was held as a warning that Americans were also to see God's divine guidance and protection and to not become puffed up with pride over their supposed martial prowess. Instead, preachers exhorted soldiers to model their service after David, who humbly prayed for victory before challenging Goliath. Quote, "I come to thee in the name of the Lord of hosts, the God of the armies of Israel, whom thou hast defied. This day will the Lord deliver thee into mine hand," end quote. Army chaplain historian Mark Thompson describes how militia chaplains of the era mirrored David's examples in their own roles. After exhorting their men to humbly submit to God's will and fight with valor, chaplains would take up arms and accompany their militia congregation into battle. Before and during the American Revolution, the image of righteous David was held up as an example of patriot Americans smiting the prideful, blaspheming British and their Tory minions as depicted as Goliath, and this was regularly invoked in sermons, as well as a May 1779 statement issued by the Continental Congress. However, the biblical David posed problems for Republican Whigs, as Byrd notes. Quote, "Any use of the Bible to denounce monarchy had to come to terms with righteous kings from ancient Israel," end quote. This point had already surfaced during the French and Indian War, as noted in Mark Knoll's essay, Christian Republicanism. Pastor Thomas Prince contrasted Tories and their insistence on the absolute power of kings with the Whig Republican perspective that the power of the British king was legitimate only when exercised within the bounds of British law and Protestant doctrine. Beginning with Republican philosopher Thomas Paine, an argument developed that held that David had been corrupted by the power of his kingship over Israel, and the resulting sins ruptured his relationship with God. The corruption of David was passed down through Solomon and Absalom and gave rise to the tyrannical rule of Rehoboam. Astute preachers saw clear parallels between David and the Hanover kings of Great Britain. Just as Israel's rebellion against Rehoboam was justified due to the king's despotism, American rebellion was equally defensible against, quote, "even a king in the most divinely ordained monarchical line. If any king or any government violated the precepts of God and liberty, the people were obliged to rebel," end quote. In his closing, James Byrd noted that historians have largely neglected the critical linkage between the spiritual realm and the military facets of the American Revolution. So I would suggest future scholarship on the Revolution, including my own work, should include careful analysis of religious motivations and influences on those involved. So thank you for watching my presentation today. Feel free to like and leave comments, and this concludes my presentation.